CommonSenseMatters right now past the hour. We're going to check in with Sandy Rice this morning on Common Sense Matters. Good morning, Sandy.
Good morning, Al. I wasn't sure if we were getting the pledge this morning. I can't tell if the kids are in or out. But
They're in school.
They're in. I know I came through two school districts to get here. Yes, this is Common Sense Matters, sponsored by the Franklin County Democratic Party to discuss the issues of the day. Today our guest is Dr. Liz Norrell, who teaches political science at Chattanooga State. Welcome, Dr. Norrell, and thank you so much for squeezing us in. The end of the semester I know is very busy.
Thanks. Yeah, it is a hectic time, but I'm happy to be with you.
Okay, we're going to discuss voter fraud, abuse, and suppression. Let me ask you this. Did you ever dream that you would be in our current situation? A sitting president and his party refusing to accept the results of an election, claiming it was rigged without proof, despite assurances by election officials and experts in communities across the country, requests to throw out thousands of votes and overturn results. Did you ever dream that would happen to us?
No, I certainly didn't.
Yes, well, how do you respond to people who say that it's rigged, that President-elect Biden is not going to be the president, that President Trump won?
Well, I think my general posture anytime somebody makes an assertion like that is to try to figure out where it's coming from. Mm-hmm. So it's easy to kind of repeat these things that you hear coming out of the mouths of lawyers and political pundits. But, I think the president himself signaled this when he was running for president in 2016,
right, that
he would accept the results if he won and he would not accept the results if he lost. And that has continued to be a theme throughout his presidency. So, this can't be seen as surprising, even if it's seen as shocking. But for people who are kind of latched on to that idea that, the only explanation for how Trump could have lost was that the system was rigged, there's something underneath that belief that I think we should be talking about, which is, anxiety about what it means to have a Democrat as president, or fear about what the future is. Those are the things that I'm more interested in than I am having kind of that surface level argument over what is or is not evidence.
Right. And to just, why do you think that? Is it?
But I think,
I mean, asking the person that.
If somebody said to me, why do you think that? I would feel a little defensive.
Okay.
And there's not a lot of really good conversation that can come when anybody is defensive. Mm-hmm. Kelly Corrigan wrote a book called Tell Me More. And I think that that's a really good phrase, right?
Right.
Tell me more
that's
about
good.
That.
Yeah.
Say more about that.
Okay.
And, what I also, when I'm having conversations with people who I don't agree with, I'll often ask them, questions like, what kind of evidence would convince you that Biden won? Or what would it mean for you if Biden won? And what would the consequences of that be?
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Okay, yeah, so to check out the fear. Well, I always forget to say our calling number, 931-967-2201, if you have a question for us. But I thought just starting with that may alleviate some calls of anger. We're not here to get mad at each other. And I know the one thing you shouldn't say to someone who believes that Trump should be president is, you're an idiot. So that's not.
Yeah, I know that this isn't what we were going to talk about, and we should definitely talk about voter fraud and some of the historical stuff. But I will just say that nobody is ever going to change their mind because you get mad at them and tell them they're wrong.
Correct. Okay.
And if we can all remember that everybody wants what's best for the country, and everybody is behaving in a manner consistent with what they think is best for the country. Mm-hmm. And, if we can recognize that in one another, then we can have more productive conversations.
Right. Well, thank you. I think that was a worthwhile part of our conversation here. So let's talk about fraud, campaign finance, civil rights violations, voter fraud. Where would you like to start?
oh my gosh, such a such a buffet of exciting options. You know, I think it's probably worthwhile to start just by recognizing that the issues that are coming up in 2020 are not new, and that, you know, we have seen efforts to limit access to voting, to talk about voter fraud for a long time.
Right.
And I think that, you know, again, if we try to put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is really advocating for more strict regulations around who can vote and what you need to vote, you know, do you need to do it in person or by mail? What kind of photo ID do you need or not? There's a concern that, you know, there may be people who are, for example, impersonating other voters or who are not citizens who are voting. And, you know, it's a good thing to want to protect the integrity of the election. I think what perhaps gets lost is how rare voter fraud is. And in a country where millions of votes are cast, the very, very, very minor incidents of, you know, somebody voted when they weren't eligible to vote, or somebody sent in an absentee ballot for their parent who passed away last month, so a dead person voted. You know, those incidents are so rare and so small that they don't tend to change the outcomes of elections at the national level.
That one person,
so,
right.
You know, I think that that's important. But I will just say, you know, after I graduated, well, actually, while I was in college in the mid-'90s, I was a journalism major, and I was interning at a newspaper in my hometown in northern Arkansas during my summer, and I covered a county commission meeting where someone was alleging that dead people had voted in the last county commission election. So this is not new. It's not new to 2020, and I think having that historical lens can help us kind of remember that these are issues that are not specific to the Trump-Biden era.
Correct. Well, there used to be a lot of voter suppression in the South.
Absolutely.
Violence and, you know, but now, well, there are different ways to suppress votes, and you mentioned the voter ID and protecting the integrity of the ballot box.
What do you think there'll be changes coming after this election? There'll be a lot of people who maybe look and study into what, you know, because of the COVID-19, there was a lot of changes. Last minute, I guess people rushing to change how election was going to look as far as voting this year. Do you think there'll be some new laws and legislation around voting that needs to come or will come before the next big election?
Yeah, you know, I'm interested by this question, and it's something that I think a lot about, because our Constitution enshrines voting as a state and a local responsibility. And so, you know, counties have generally wide discretion over how people will vote. So is that going to be on electronic machines? Is it going to be a piece of paper that you bubble in? And, you know, so even in Tennessee, you know, I vote in Marion County because I live just over the Marion County line, where we vote on an electronic machine by tapping a screen. My students in Chattanooga, they vote on paper. And, you know, that's just a few miles away. And so, you know, when you ask about whether there's going to be new regulations, I think, you know, this bumps up against the issue of kind of local control of elections. And it's something that kind of interestingly right now, in fact, just this week, is kind of reversing what we would expect to be the arguments of the Democrats and Republicans. So Democrats are really arguing right now for continued local control of elections, that we have to make decisions that are right for our communities. And we see, you know, in this lawsuit that's, well, it's not even a lawsuit yet, but in this case that the Texas Attorney General is trying to bring to the Supreme Court, they're saying that because decisions were made in other states to change the way votes would be accepted, and that those changes were made by the Supreme Courts of those states, that somehow has injured Texas, and the Supreme Court should throw out those decisions. Well, I mean, this is the very opposite of states' rights. This is Texas trying to dictate what is or is not okay in Pennsylvania. And that's not what we normally think of when we think of Republicans. So that's a really long-winded way of saying I think, there are certainly a lot of questions about how we run elections. Historically, I've always felt a lot of resistance from many sides, both on the left and the right, from national legislation about how you can or can't run elections. But I think maybe we're entering into a period where people are going to be more amenable to that. I don't know. I would certainly personally be happy to see some clear guidelines about what you can and can't do. And that's what the Voting Rights Act tried to do, but that has, I think it's probably time for a new look at that.
Right. Well, do you want to talk about the Voting Rights Act and how that was kind of gutted by the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the Voting Rights Act, the case that you're thinking of, I think, is the one that came out of Alabama.
Shelby versus
one where,
Holder.
Just in the last few years, I can't remember exactly when, the Supreme Court eliminated the part of the Voting Rights Act that said that jurisdictions, so states or counties, that had a history of trying to disenfranchise minority voters, the Voting Rights Act required those places to get pre-clearance from the Justice Department before they made changes to, say, polling locations or hours or whatever. And that was in an effort to remedy some of those really egregious efforts to limit minority access to vote. The Supreme Court essentially said, we've fixed all of that. We don't need this kind of scrutiny anymore, so we're not going to require those states and jurisdictions to get pre-clearance for changes. And in the wake of that Supreme Court decision, we've seen a lot of places in the South primarily make it harder for people to vote. So, for example, in Atlanta during the presidential election, you would see very long lines during the primary especially for voting in relatively poor neighborhoods that had higher concentrations of Black and Hispanic voters, and no lines in the wealthy suburbs that had primarily white voters. And so those are the kinds of things that the Voting Rights Act, that particular section of it, were designed to avoid. And in the wake of its being tossed out by the Supreme Court, we've seen some of those disparities start to creep back in.
Right, and that's, matching up names, shorter days, hours of early voting, closing polls.
Though, even when the Voting Rights Act, when that section of the Voting Rights Act was enforced, it didn't necessarily catch all of that bad behavior. So I'm thinking particularly in the election of 2000 in Florida, which if you lived through it, you'll never forget. The Secretary of State of Florida had contracted with a company to find the names of people who were felons and perhaps out of prison, but who at that time were not allowed to vote in Florida, to find those names and any close matches on the voter rolls, and they purged the voter registration of thousands and thousands of people, almost all of them African American. And, that's something that the Voting Rights Act didn't prevent in 2000 when it was still in force. So, I don't want to suggest that it was perfect before and now it's not.
It was an impenetrable wall against problems. And Tennessee has, well, let me go back to, I think a big thing with this election was the absentee ballots. And because we were in a pandemic, that's been a big issue, that those are very easy to manipulate or commit fraud. Do you think that's true?
I don't think so. I think, what people perhaps, and, we saw some discussion, particularly leading up to Election Day, where we heard a lot about Pennsylvanians needing to make sure they didn't send in a naked ballot. And so one thing that I think people may not realize is that when you vote absentee, there are two envelopes, and you have to sign one of them, the one that's sort of nested inside, and that signature gets compared to the voter rolls before that vote is opened and counted. And so if, for example, like I said earlier, if someone tried to send in an absentee ballot for their parent who had passed away a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, they would have to sign it, and the election officials would compare that signature to the signature that was on the books with that voter's registration. And if they didn't match, they would, get set to the side, and that voter might, in some places, have the opportunity to come in and fix it, or do what they call curing the problem, curing the ballot. But, I think a lot of people imagine that you can just sort of go around and hoover up a bunch of absentee ballots and send them into your election commission, and they'll all get counted. But that's just not how the system works. And so to commit voter fraud by absentee, you have to be really good at forging signatures, and you're also, of course, running the risk in doing so of getting caught and going to jail. I mean, these are not light offenses against the government. Those are considered, felony crimes.
Right. I think that's
Something that's bothered me with mail-in ballots is I don't understand why it doesn't run concurrent with the early voting. Why it doesn't end at the same time early voting ends, that if you're going to do a mail-in, it has to be in by that date, instead of some places, as long as it's postmarked by midnight on election night, it's counted. It could be 2 or 3 days before that ballot gets to the election office, and it kind of delays things. Why does it not run with early voting?
Yeah, it's a great question, and honestly, I think it's probably just because early voting has become very popular in the last 15, 20 years in a way that it wasn't before. But we've been doing absentee or mail-in ballots since the founding of our country. And, if you think back, like during the Civil War, it would be unrealistic for people to expect their ballots to arrive before Election Day in the 1800s or early 1900s. But, that's something where, as you asked earlier, this might be an opportunity to do some updating of our election regulations. The other thing I would say is that, a lot of the people who take advantage of absentee ballots, I wouldn't say this year this was the majority, but it's certainly a substantial number, are people who are traveling, either domestically, not so much internationally this year, but and also military personnel who send absentee ballots back to their home location. And so, they may be so far away that it may be unrealistic to expect them to get those back in the early voting period. But I think that we could all help ourselves by allowing states, sort of, if every state could have this conversation and allow the processing of absentee ballots as they come in, rather than, as some states do, requiring that they be set aside and not touched until Election Day. So, of course, the big problem in Pennsylvania, if you want to call it a problem, was that Pennsylvania law did not allow them to even open the ballots and start comparing signatures until 7 a.m. on Election Day. And they had thousands of absentee ballots to process. And so, that caused the results to be delayed quite a bit. I think that, if we allowed election commissions to process those ballots as they came in, then the very few that come after Election Day would not be as big of an issue as it seemed to be this year.
Mm-hmm. What else could we do to make voting easier?
Well, we could make Election Day a national holiday. That would be lovely, so that people who can't get off from work and can't go vote early have an opportunity to do so. I do think that, we could certainly have fewer elections. And it may sound strange to think about, someone who teaches American government talking about how we have too many elections, but we vote all the time, many times a year. And, that's more than most people have the time or the bandwidth to keep
the
up
wherewithal.
with. So if we could try to streamline our election calendars so we're only asking people to vote once or twice a year, that would help everybody know when the elections are and what they're voting for. So, I think those things would help. It would be nice if we had, I know that people can get a photo ID if they don't have a driver's license at their, at their local, that's available throughout the country. But I think if we would allow other kinds of photo ID that would be helpful. So, for example, in Tennessee, you can use your concealed carry license
Right.
as a photo ID, but you cannot use a student ID
Right.
as a photo ID. I'm not sure I understand why one is better than the other, especially if the student ID is issued by a state institution. It seems like it ought to count as well. So, those things I think would be helpful. And it would also be nice if it were easier for people to get to their polling location.
Right.
So, there are lots of people who don't drive or who can't drive, and it's a real burden to get to the polls. And when we have a system that, as in Tennessee, that it really kind of makes it challenging to vote absentee, that can be a challenge for people as well.
Right. Well, some states went to a universal absentee ballot, and we did not. Although I think if you had concerns about COVID, a pre-existing condition, or they didn't ask a lot of questions, you could just check the box. You didn't need a doctor's excuse as to why, which is sometimes hard to get, especially if you're older or homebound, to get a doctor's excuse for jury duty and absentee ballot and things like that. So that was good. We do have the other thing was, did you have students? This was, I'm from Swanee, so in the past, a first-time voter had to go back to their home in the middle of a semester to vote. And that kind of went back and forth, and I think eventually first-time voters could do absentee. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, so the way it works in Tennessee is if you register to vote, so if you fill out your voter registration form online or by mail, then you must appear in person to vote the first time so that they can visually inspect your photo ID. But if you register to vote in person, then you can vote absentee.
Okay, so you have to show that at some point. So you could do that earlier. Okay. And then a few years ago, in 2018, there were so many new registered voters to vote in the 2018 election that the legislature here passed, they wanted to criminalize registration drives if you'd registered too many people. Do you remember that? And that was reversed.
Yeah, so the contours of that are that they essentially, in the past, organizations like the League of Women Voters, for example, could have a voter registration drive where they would help people fill out their forms, and then the organization would send those all in as a batch to be processed. And that law, essentially, it didn't make it a crime to do that, but it said if there was anything wrong with the forms, if they were not filled out correctly or whatever, then the organization would have some liability for that.
Right. Okay. All right. So in some of my reading, I don't think that Tennessee has been as bad as some other states in the South as far as, to me, these are voter suppression tactics, trying to discourage someone from voting by closing their polling place. It affects mostly black, poor, and rural folks. But you have to keep an eye on all this stuff because they have tried to sneak a few things in. They kind of clarified purging, too. This was a big problem in Georgia and I think Florida, too, purging a lot of voters if they were inactive. They didn't vote for a couple of years. And now I believe that Tennessee sends a card to an address to see if they've moved or they're, deceased before purging. So I thought that sounded a little bit better than just getting rid of people if they haven't voted for a couple of years. Stuff happens.
I will say that for, county election commission officials and for the secretaries of state of the different states, it's really hard to keep an accurate voter roll because people do move, and people are moving, I feel like, more now than they had historically, and they don't always get a notice if you've changed your voter registration. So if you change within the state of Tennessee, that's easy enough, but if you, say, move from Tennessee to Georgia or vice versa, Tennessee may not get a notice that you've moved out of state, and so it's really hard for them to keep a voter roll that's accurate. Mm-hmm. And so on the one hand, you want to kind of have as comprehensive of coverage of eligible voters as possible, and so you'd want to err on the side of not purging people. But then, after an election like this, when you see that there are so many people on the eligible voter rolls who have passed away or who have moved, that starts to look like, well, maybe that's, an opportunity for people to commit fraud. And so they're really kind of between a rock and a hard place, and that's difficult work to do, to keep the voter rolls updated. So I have a lot of sympathy for the challenges of that work, even though, we may sometimes feel like the actions they take are too aggressive in one way or another.
Right. Well, and, that is our responsibility as well as voters to realize that that's important, to keep that aspect along with your credit cards and your, electrical bill and everything. If you move, you don't have to do these things if you die, but if you move, you should add voter reinstatement or notification or whatever. So we're going to see this, I think, a little bit in Georgia, but the Georgia runoff, whether people are going to say it's still my duty to vote, it's still important despite all these negative things that have happened with this election, or are they going to just say the heck with it and give up? I have canvassed people just and even in this neighborhood here in Winchester that say, nothing ever changes. I'm not going to vote. It doesn't make any difference. Do you think we're going to see more or less of that type of attitude?
I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that on the one hand, people say no matter what I vote for or how I vote or if I vote, nothing ever changes, but then the idea that one candidate won and another one lost is so threatening that people are willing to imagine taking up arms to protest. They can't both be true at the same time. You just sort of have that observation to make. But I do sense that a lot of people feel like the whole government, I see this with my students all the time, that the whole government is corrupt and that my vote is never going to make a difference and why bother and nothing ever changes. But I'm reminded of, I try to remind my students, and I'm personally reminded of how many things have changed because of the actions of a single person. And if I may just sort of share this story that
Yes.
I share with my students that I think is so powerful. The last time the Constitution was amended was in 1992, and it was the 27th Amendment that says, essentially, if Congress votes to give themselves a raise, they can't start getting a bigger paycheck until after the next election.
Mm-hmm.
And so this compensation amendment was ratified in 1992, but it was originally proposed in the 1790s by James Madison as one of the original Bill of Rights proposals. And it got a handful of states that ratified it, but then it never made it past the threshold to become an amendment, and it just sort of sat around for 200 years until a college student wrote a paper in the 1980s at the University of Texas at Austin arguing that this amendment was still viable, and if a few more states ratified it, it could become an amendment to the Constitution. And his teacher said, well, that's crazy. That's, this is a total, this is a crazy fantasy of yours. And he said, well, I'm just going to get it ratified. So he did. He started writing letters to state legislators saying, I want your state to ratify this amendment. And he got Maine on board, and then he attracted the attention of some prominent local, national politicians. Eventually, Ralph Nader got on board. The Washington Post wrote a profile, and he got enough states to ratify it. This is a college student who was writing letters on his typewriter that he paid for by working at Dillard's on the weekends. If he can get an amendment to the Constitution passed, think about the power that each of us has if we're willing to just say, this is not right, and I'm not going to stop until I make it right. You think about Brian Stevenson, who runs the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. He wrote a book called Just Mercy. They made a movie out of it last year. But, that's one person who said, it's not right that people who are on death row have such terrible legal representation. So I'm going to start representing cases, representing people who are on death row. And he's gotten dozens of people exonerated from death row because they had had such inadequate representation. So I think it's easy to become complacent and imagine that one person in a country of 330 some odd million can make a difference, but you can. And in fact, the only way that change has ever happened is because somebody said, I'm not going to take this anymore.
And they worked on it more than on election day.
Yes.
You know, there's always, well, you just come to my church, or you just call me, or just care about me, you know, when there's an election coming up. So, you know, that I think dissuades a lot of, you know, voters too, that they aren't really important. Well, on both sides of that, the individual citizen and the politician, you know, needs to be working and on things, you know, really all the time. So
Yes.
just, you know, find something that you care about and that you know, feel like you could want, you know, you want to change, but it's not always an option for everyone. Helen had asked a lot of questions, wanted me to ask a lot of questions about, you know, the results of the election and President-elect Biden, and what do you think about his upcoming presidency? What kind of problems is he going to have? Any thoughts on that? Like,
Well, I think I have to say I'm curious and also a little nervous about January the 20th and what the specter of that will bring, given the stubborn insistence of the current administration that they have not lost. And, you know, I don't spend a lot of time paying attention to people in that orbit, or really either side. I think, you know, I don't care too much for 24-hour news networks or anything like that, but I wonder what's going to happen at the inauguration and kind of that transition of power. I hope it goes smoothly. But I think obviously, as soon as Biden takes the oath of office and becomes president, he's going to have a number of things to deal with. The coronavirus obviously is a big challenge. I think, you know, immigration is a pressing issue on the Biden administration. Some of our relationships with other countries, I think, are going to need some TLC. And, you know, I think that those are the things that are probably going to be front of mind for Biden. The economy and recovering from the COVID pandemic is also going to be really important. And so I hope, and I anticipate, honestly, I see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as people who are more pragmatic than they are ideological, right? They want to get things done, and they have both shown a willingness to work with people across the ideological spectrum. And I hope that they will usher in a new era of cooperation and sanity in the running of our government.
I do too. I think we have a question. Do we have a question, Al?
You do?
All right. Hi, this is Common Sense Matters. Do you have a question for Dr. Norrell?
I've got a question that I'd like you to touch on. Another type of voter suppression is gerrymandering. And with this being the year of the census, and congressional districts are being redrawn and state legislative districts will be redrawn, gerrymandering makes it, you know, almost that your vote doesn't count if you have been drawn into a certain district. Can you touch on that?
Oh my goodness, I would love to talk about gerrymandering. I think gerrymandering is the biggest problem that nobody knows about in this country, honestly. So for people who may not be aware, gerrymandering is simply drawing legislative districts to favor a particular group. So usually it's going to be partisan gerrymandering, districts drawn so that a particular party wins. And this is done, as the caller has said, every 10 years immediately following the census. So at the end of this year or early next year, the Census Bureau will present to the president what they call the reapportionment, which says how many House of Representative seats each state will get. And then the states in 2021 will engage in the process of redrawing the boundaries for congressional districts, so that's House seats. Also for, as the caller said, state legislative districts, so both state House and state Senate. That also happens at the local level, so county commission, city council districts, because the Constitution has been interpreted by the Supreme Court to require that everybody has the same size of a vote, or same size of a voice. So basically, every district has to have exactly the same number of people based on census data. And so when you're drawing those lines, especially with the technology we have today, the GIS systems of mapping and all of the data that we have on voters, everything from what magazines you subscribe to what organizations you've donated money to, those things all get used to kind of make predictions about how you vote. And map makers, there's a whole group of them that can draw these maps very, very carefully to ensure that a majority of people in a particular district are of a particular party persuasion. And so, the way I often talk about this is that, gerrymandering kind of flips the democratic paradigm on its head. Instead of voters choosing their elected officials, gerrymandering allows elected officials to choose who their voters will be. Mm-hmm. And, this is a very big problem that most Americans either don't know about, don't understand, or don't care about. But I think we should. Mm-hmm. And what we know is that when voters kind of get hip to this, it goes down.
Okay.
When citizens pressure their state legislators to gerrymander less, they gerrymander less. And sometimes that happens because voters or constituents, citizens will get an initiative put on the ballot to require a change to the way we do redistricting. That's not really an option in Tennessee. We could do a constitutional amendment, perhaps, to not allow partisan gerrymandering. But the problem is that if it's not a big issue for voters, it's not going to be a big issue for their elected representatives, because getting rid of gerrymandering reduces their power and influence. So this really only changes when a critical mass of citizens says, I'm not okay with this.
Mm-hmm. Is this something that the federal government, we had talked earlier about there's some things that maybe we need bigger oversight on a national level. Is this something that they could say, stop it? Because it's not going to change if the Democrats are in power, because they're going to do it the same way.
Exactly. Yeah, both parties do this, and we see it. We see it in every single state. And there have been efforts to litigate this. And at one point, the Supreme Court, Anthony Kennedy especially, said, if you can bring me a clear standard to be able to say this is partisan gerrymandering and this is not, then we might be willing to say that it's unconstitutional.
Okay.
And then the most recent case that came before the Supreme Court, they said, no, this is a political problem. This isn't a legal problem. And so it's not really our place to make decisions about political issues. Our job is to apply the law. And so, there's not much that the Supreme Court could do. Congress benefits from gerrymandering.
Right. Mm-hmm.
This is how, for example, in the House of Representatives, for years, Democrats who ran for the House received thousands, perhaps millions more votes than Republicans, but Republicans had a majority in the House. And so, they're not going to change the system because it benefits them. Again, unless there's enough pressure from citizens that they feel if they don't do something, they risk losing their job.
Sounds like a good class project, Professor.
Yes.
Need anybody that have anybody that needs extra credit?
Well, yeah, and I think honestly, I know that you're being somewhat facetious, but I do think that this is the kind of thing, and there's a group in Chattanooga that's working to try to push for nonpartisan redistricting in Tennessee. There are other groups this is on the radar. It's very much on the radar. There was a ballot initiative in a couple of states in the 2020 election to take redistricting out of the hands of the state legislature, and they passed. When these things get on the ballot, they pass. So I think that there's certainly an opportunity here for people to get involved in some grassroots.
That's right.
Effort.
That's right.
So what do you think? All right, it was this year in which we did all of our census counting and everything, but yet the COVID hit and a lot of people were hesitant and they didn't really get a lot of people counted and things like that. Do you see a lot of shakeups when it comes to redistricting in states and other states and everything this year?
And the immigration question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether they counted or
I
not.
think that the census was, unfortunately, it became rather politicized this year. And, of course, trying to take a census during a global pandemic is not for the faint of heart. Certainly not ideal. But I think, from what I've seen, local governments did a really nice job of telling people, like, this matters. You really need to fill out your census and be involved. I'm curious to see what the reapportionment numbers are going to look like. I do suspect that if we undercounted people, it was probably pretty randomly distributed among the states. So I don't know that, like, for example, people in Alabama were less likely to fill out their census form than people in Tennessee or Kentucky. But, I do think that it's going to be a challenge. One of the things that the Census Bureau has talked about in the last, honestly, 20, 30 years has been, instead of trying to count every single person, trying to do what the statisticians call sampling. So they kind of take a sample of people and then extrapolate from that a mathematical model. That would probably get us a more accurate count. But it also kind of feels, I don't know, it doesn't feel as trustworthy, does it, as counting every person? But of course there are problems with counting every person, because there are some neighborhoods where, there's probably low response rate, and census workers don't feel especially safe going to try to count people in person.
Right. And
as you mentioned, the problem of people who are here without citizenship or proper documentation, they get counted because the Census Bureau, the census clause in the Constitution says by counting the whole number of persons, not the whole number of citizens. And so, we count everybody, regardless of whether you're here legally or not, and that gets used to decide how many seats of representation will happen. And, another thing that comes up with the census and redistricting that I think people probably don't think about is that the census and redistricting takes into account the number of people in a district. So that means if you have a large facility, a jail or a prison, those people get counted in the population, and they get counted as part of who's being represented, but they can't vote. And so there are some districts where there are very large prison facilities where in a local election there may only be a few dozen eligible voters to run for, say, city council or county commission. And so it creates these very strange, interesting downstream, not problems, but kind of bizarre election scenarios.
Should felons be able to vote?
That's a challenging issue. I personally sort of err on the side of feeling like if you are a member of a country, you should have a voice in how that country gets run. I mean, it would be difficult to find someone more impacted by the consequences of government decisions than people whose freedom has been taken away by that government, as a punishment for things that they've done. I certainly think that people who have left prison should be allowed to vote.
Right.
Just because, they've served their time. They've completed their sentence. And I don't understand why you don't get all the rights back of being a productive member of society once you're no longer being punished actively. Whether people who are currently incarcerated should vote, I feel like that's an issue where I could see kind of both sides of it. But personally, I would probably land on the side of yes.
Well, they can get their voting rights restored, but it's usually complicated.
It's very complicated. I had a student,
and it's costly.
Probably 15 years ago, who was going through that process. He had served time for kind of drug-related offenses in the 70s, and was still fighting to try to get his voting rights restored. And this is somebody who, you think about the people who are coming out of prison, all of the challenges that they have to face to try to get back into a job when it's harder to do that, and get housing when people may be afraid to rent to them or sell to them. And then we're going to add on top of that the enormous effort it takes to get your voting rights restored. It's just such a huge burden. And again, it's hard to imagine someone who has more of a sense of the importance of government and the power of government than someone who's lived in a prison or a jail for a substantial portion of their lives.
Right. Just with a few minutes left, can you talk a little bit about the Electoral College? I know there are some movements, there's discussions to eliminate it, and I think there is some states that are agreeable to that. Should we do that? Should we look at that?
Oh, I have so many complicated feelings about the Electoral College.
Well, I gave you 6
most
minutes,
Americans
so
sort of feel one of two ways. Either, this is just an archaic, anachronistic, really, system that just doesn't make sense in 2020, and we should abolish it and just use a popular vote. The other side of that tends to be people who say, the Electoral College is important because it gives smaller states a voice. It kind of protects rural communities by making sure that the big cities don't run everything. And, I get that. Excuse me. I will say that if the Electoral College's purpose is to give candidates a reason to care about small states, they don't, when they're campaigning, they don't go to small states. Nobody's going to Wyoming and Rhode Island. Nobody's going to South Dakota to, do a serious, appeal to voters there. So the Electoral College isn't doing a great job of getting candidates to care about small states. It may make the voters in those states feel like they're more important, but the states that we were talking about this year as deciding the election are not particularly small states.
Right.
So, I'm not sure that the Electoral College achieves the goals that people who defend it say that it would. I'm not totally convinced that we need to do away with the Electoral College. If I were in charge and I could snap my fingers and change the system, I would have every state work the way that Maine and Nebraska work. So the way that they do their Electoral College vote allocation, so every state, let me just back up for a minute, every state has a number of Electoral College votes equal to their 2 senators plus the number of U.S. House of Representatives that they have, and that's done based on population. So in Tennessee, for example, we have 2 senators, 9 House members, so we have 11 Electoral College votes. If Tennessee were to use the plan, the district plan that Maine and Nebraska use, the overall statewide winner of the popular vote, so whoever got the most votes statewide, would get our 2 Senate seat votes, if you imagine. And then the winner of each congressional district would win that congressional district's Electoral College vote. So presumably, if we used that system in Tennessee in 2020, Donald Trump would have gotten 9 of our Electoral College votes from the 7 congressional districts that elected Republicans, plus the 2 statewide votes. And Joe Biden would have gotten 2 of the Electoral College votes, the 2 districts, Shelby County and Davidson County, that elected Democrats to the House. So this would allow for a slightly more proportional outcome, and it would maintain some of the benefits of the Electoral College. So that's what I personally, if I were in charge, would do. But I certainly understand the arguments for why getting rid of it or keeping it. I understand those perspectives.
Well, the feeling that the popular vote should count.
I mean, I think it does count. And I will say that if we used this system that I'm talking about in 2016, the outcome would have been the same but closer, so Donald Trump still would have won. So it's not the kind of system that's going to change the outcome in an election where it's not particularly close, as it wasn't in 2016 in the Electoral College. Also in 2020, it would not have changed the outcome, but it would at least allow people to feel like, if you're a Democrat living in Tennessee, and you happen to live in Shelby County or Davidson County where there's a large concentration, you would feel like your vote is mattering, that it's going to contribute in some meaningful way to the presidential election.
Well, I think certainly getting candidates out to other states, I think I read somewhere that, Iowa's easy. Everybody goes there multiple times, but, and we get Republican candidates here, I guess, because it's very red here in Tennessee, but other states too. It would be nice to meet the possible future senator, or not senator, but president.
Absolutely.
You know, it's kind of exciting. But well, you handled that very nicely. Dr. Norrell, this has been delightful talking to you. I don't know about anyone else, but I may go back to school and be a political science major.
Well, we'd be happy to have you at Chattanooga State.
Or history, one or the other.
Yes.
So thank you so much, and for being here. I'm a nurse. People know that I'm a nurse practitioner, retired, and I want to just tell people to please get the vaccine, to look at the data for that, and to be safe. Even though I'm a retired healthcare provider, it just breaks my heart to see these nurses and physicians on the news just begging people to follow guidelines, take the vaccine, because they're exhausted. The hospitals are filling up. They're caring for patients that are very, very ill and dying, and that's just horrible. And someone I heard last night on the news just said, what can we do? Why aren't we getting to people? So that's a whole nother program, but please,
Can I just add one quick thing about that?
Yes, please.
I hear a lot of people talking about how it's incredible that we've got a vaccine this quickly, and that must mean that it can't be trusted. But what's really interesting is that the team that developed the teams that started developing this vaccine, they're using vaccine technology from previous coronaviruses. So the way that the vaccine works is the same way that it's worked on SARS and SIRS, these other coronaviruses. They just basically reused the same technology, and then made it specific, to this strain of coronavirus. So it's not like this is brand new invention. They're just reusing something that's worked before.
Well, it's something that they were working on, and that's the RNA. That there's no disease, no coronavirus at all in the vaccine, but they have had this technology. I feel like we've really lost sight of what science can do. Science is not political, and there have been people working on this technology for a long time.
Yes.
And in fact, we're wondering how they could prove that it worked, and then the coronavirus came and said, "Oh, okay, we don't need to do a test run. We've got a disease here that we have to conquer." So, but that's excellent comment. All right, we'll turn it back to an altering Christmas Carol and oldies station.
Okay.
This has been Common Sense Matters. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. This morning you're listening to WCDT AM 1340, FM 106.9 in Winchester, Tennessee.
Time for your WCDT Community Calendar. Benefit auction and supper for Cheryl Fincham. This benefit is to help for funeral expenses. Cheryl was a wife, mother, daughter, sister, and friend to many. She leaves behind 5 children and 2 stepdaughters. She was employed